In his book, Cooked, Michael Pollan describes what he sees as how the most likely story about how bread was discovered. In ancient Egypt, about 8,000 years ago, he writes that one of the dietary staples of the time was a porridge, kind of a mush, made out of whatever seeds the Egyptians could find. So maybe grass seeds or wild barley, wild wheat. They'd gather the seeds up, they'd crush them up a little bit, they'd pour boiling water over them, stir them up, make this kind of porridgey mush, and they would eat that as part of their daily meals. Some at breakfast, some 5-year-old boy probably decided he didn't really care for his mush that day, and his mom said fine, and then presented it to him again at lunch, and then later in the day again at dinner, still unfinished. And after a couple days of this, they noticed that the bowl of porridge was now sort of bubbling. Something was going on. There were little bubbles breaking the surface. It was putting off a different kind of smell than they'd ever smelled before. What they didn't know, what had happened, is that wild yeasts floating around in the air had fallen into the bowl and started doing their reactions, eating the sugar and creating this gas, and that this kind of reaction was going on, and this porridge was undergoing kind of transformation. It started growing, it got a little spongier, the bubbles got larger, and they kept watching. They were curious about what might happen next, and someone came up with the bright idea, wondered what would happen if they put it on one of the hot stones by the fire. And they did that, and it got even bigger, and it developed a brown crust. It smelled really pretty good, and when it cooled down, they tried it and had discovered bread. This miracle that kind of happened out of a bowl of mush and stuff, invisible stuff floating around in the air. But it started a real revolution, because the Egyptians discovered that they could make different kinds of breads by using different kinds of grains, and so they started cultivating different kinds of grains, and agriculture was born. And then this whole economy grew up around that, of folks who had land and were able to have large plots of land to grow the grains, and they would sell those grains to folks who would then make bread out of them, who would then sell that bread to folks who wanted to eat it. A whole economy grew up around this miracle of bread. If you've been listening the last few weeks, we've heard a lot of Jesus talking about bread. Jesus calls himself the bread of life. And I'm sorry to say that if you're tired of hearing Jesus talk about bread, you have 2 more weeks to listen to Jesus talk about bread. I think he talks a lot about bread in the 6th chapter of John, because he's trying to get his listeners to look at the world in a radically different way. The bread that they know, the bread that they put on their table, comes out of this economy of scarcity. Some people have things and other people don't have things. And in those interactions of who has stuff and who doesn't, who needs things that other people have, this economy works out so that some people get to eat and some people ultimately don't get to eat. Jesus tries over and over again to convince his followers that that's not the way life has to be. And so he has this miracle we heard about a couple weeks ago, the miracle of the loaves and the fishes, where he turns that few loaves of bread into enough food to feed 5,000 people with enough left over. And then he spends the rest of the 6th chapter of John talking about that miracle. The crowds have all sorts of questions. They seek him out because they want him to do that miracle again. He fed them once, and he figures if he could do it once, that he could do it again. And he says, no, you misunderstand the point of that miracle. The point of that miracle wasn't to feed you. The point of that miracle was to point out who I am, to reveal who I am, that I am the bread of life. And in this morning's reading, that crowd's getting just a little bit impatient. They're exasperated. They're thinking, Jesus is saying all these really kind of high-flying things about himself. He's the living bread, he's the bread from heaven, he comes from heaven. They're like, isn't this Joseph and Mary's kid? The kid who hit the baseball through my kitchen window when he was 8? The kid who was always in trouble in high school? That kid who spent 10 years out in the middle of the wilderness with that weird prophet John doing heaven knows what? Where does he get off now, coming back and telling us that he's the living bread, the bread of heaven, that he comes from on high? And Jesus patiently says, no, this is how this works. The bread that I will provide, the bread that you can take hold of by living into the person that God calls you to be. The bread that you can eat by believing in me, by putting your faith in me, by putting your heart in me, is bread that will satisfy you forever. It will give you the life that God wants you to have. It will give you eternal life. Jesus says to the folks following him around, the world does not have to be this economy of scarcity that you have made it into. When you look at the world through that lens of scarcity, you spend your time hoarding things. You hoard money, you hoard possessions, you hoard people, you hoard power, you hoard influence. You do that because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't have those things. But by holding on to those things, Jesus says, you cut yourself off from the life-giving experiences that God wants you to have in this world. If you look at the world through the lens of scarcity, Jesus says, you will become a pool of anxiety. It's kind of free-form anxiety that will paralyze you, make you unable to live the good life that God wants you to have. Today's the anniversary, as you know, of the events in Charlottesville a year ago that very hard for me to get my mind around the folks who were demonstrating, the white supremacists. I've struggled over the last year to understand where that impulse comes from. And I think part of it comes from looking at the world through a lens of scarcity. A belief, a mistaken belief, that if others have rights, if others have equal access, if others have dignity, that somehow that means there are less rights, there is less access, there is less dignity for me. That is looking at the world through a lens of scarcity. Jesus invites us to look at the world through God's eyes, through a lens of abundance, where there is enough for all. There are enough rights, there is enough access, there is enough dignity, there is enough bread for all of us. And by doing that, Jesus says, by giving our heart to Jesus, by believing in Jesus, by taking hold of what he promises, we can live the life that God calls us to. We can live this eternal life. I heard interviews this week with Heather Heyer's mother. Heather Heyer was the woman who was killed when a car plowed into the crowd in Charlottesville last year. And her mother has spent the last year kind of working in Heather's memory on issues that she knew that Heather was concerned about. Heather was a paralegal. She had gone to the rally that day because she was concerned about rights for others. She was opposed to the white supremacist message that the demonstration was about. And she ended up losing her life that day because of what she believed in, because of the work that she was doing. But somehow, through her mother's work, through her memory, through Heather's memory, Heather lives on. Heather truly has the eternal life that God wants us to have. My prayer for us this week is that we will put aside the lens of scarcity with which we look at the world, that we will not worry about having enough for ourselves, but that we will look at the world through the lens of abundance that God invites us to. That we will realize that there is enough bread for all, that there are enough rights for all, there is enough dignity for all, there is enough access for all, that there is enough love for everyone.